Oh, oops.
Intro.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. We have it's a great pleasure to have experts from SDSU to join us and talk a little bit about the Native American culture. And I don't want to interrupt too much, so if you guys want to introduce yourselves, you're more than welcome to. And I'll mute myself. And thank you so much for coming.
We are really, really happy to be here with you. I'm Dr. Carol Robinson Zanyartu, and it's been my very great pleasure to direct Native American scholars projects for the last 25 years or so at San Diego State. We want to acknowledge first that we live and work on the land of the Kumeyaay, that the Kumeyaay Nation are the people who have nourished this land since time immemorial, and we honor that heritage, and we are really pleased to be able to work with the people of the Kumeyaay Nation. So Shervin asked me to say a few words about the project. We are a project that supports graduate students to become school psychologists and school counselors specializing in work with Native American and Indigenous issues and communities. We are very interested in truth-telling, in healing the wounds of historical trauma, in empowering local youth and communities and making a difference in the lives of our Indigenous communities and the schools that serve them, because we know it's all relational, that we have to pay attention to all of the various variables. And our graduates let me say this, that our scholars who are in the project are also in graduate school in a program for either school psychology or school counseling. At the same time they're on the project. Our graduates of the project go back to their home communities very often to become school psychologists or school counselors there. So when I got your invitation to share and to present, I was very excited because you are a group that's also very interested in truth-telling and social justice and activism. And we were excited to take on the challenge of dispelling misconceptions about Native Americans. So in that spirit, the very first misconception I thought I would dispel is that Native Americans no longer exist. This is that they are remnants of history. And so one of the things that we hear very often right now across Native communities is we are still here. To acknowledge that in fact, there's a very, very real and strong presence of Native American Indigenous peoples across the country and across multiple countries actually. And the second very brief misconception is that there is one Native American culture. It turns out there's, in this country, over 570 federally recognized tribes. And in California alone, we are home to 111 tribes. We have the largest population of Native Americans in the US. Not the highest concentration, but the highest actual number. Some people live on reservations or raised on reservations, some in cities. Some speak their heritage languages, others do not. So today you're going to meet three people from different Native nations. Each of them has an important perspective, and we thought we would take the time to kind of present a historical perspective, current perspectives, and a California perspective that we thought would be interesting to your group. So we're going to start with Star Greensky, who will introduce herself and talk about misconceptions about Indigenous people before contact, before Columbus. And then we'll have Rochelle Peterson speak to something very close to us in California, the missions and the mission, infamous mission projects. And finally, Jacob Price will talk about the issue of mascots. So I think maybe what we can do is just listen to all three, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and comments. Does that work? Great. Star, let's start with you. You want to introduce yourself?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carol. I'm going to go ahead and start just by sharing my screen. That might be the easiest way. All right. Can everybody see that? Great. Okay. Good morning, Bonjour. How? My name is Star Green Sky. I am Oglala Lakota and Leech Lake Anishinaabe. It's my first year in the San Diego State University School Psychology program. I actually grew up in the Santa Barbara area, which is just a couple hours north of here in San Diego. And I grew up as what some would refer to as an urban native, meaning that I didn't grow up on a reservation and I actually grew up very far from my ancestral lands. My Oglala Lakota side of my family is from the South Dakota area, the Great Plains area, and the Leech Lake Anishinaabe side of my family is from the Minnesota or Great Lakes area. So, the first kind of misconception that I really want to focus on today is the idea that prior to Columbus coming to the Americas, Indigenous peoples were simple, they were primitive, and they lived in barbarism and savagery. Unfortunately, this is most notably talked about in the Declaration of Independence, where the founding fathers referred to Indigenous peoples as merciless Indian savages. The first area I'm going to focus on are the complex systems of governance that many tribal nations had before colonization and are still in practice today. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, is actually believed to be the model for the American Constitution and is known as one of the oldest standing democracies in the world. It's comprised of 5 tribes: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca nations. Each of these tribes delegate a number of representatives based on the size of the tribal clan, so based on their population size. These delegated representatives are referred to as sachems, and then these sachems are then finalized by the clan mother. So there is a checks and balances system in place as well. The Confederacy Grand Council is made up of 50 sachems, and they often meet to discuss and debate on proposed ideas. These proposals would not move forward if a general consensus was not reached. This picture we have here is of the Hiawatha Belt, and it's actually known as one of the oldest peace treaties. It's referred to as, although it's not in words necessarily, the symbols and the beaded pattern is referred to as I said, one of the oldest peace treaties known to still exist. The beaded pattern here represents the 5 tribes in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Starting here from the right, actually, it goes the Mohawk, the Oneida, Onondaga in the middle, the Cayuga, and then the Seneca over on the left. The second kind of area I would like to focus on is the idea that Indigenous peoples understood the land and how to sustainably manage the land. When Europeans reached the Americas, the land was not this untouched, pristine wilderness. The condition of the land was actually a result of a millennia of strategic land management methods done by Indigenous peoples and practiced for years prior. Indigenous societies, most notably in California, were really known to practice what are called controlled burns or prescribed burns, which now we understand really promotes the growth of traditional foods, wildlife, and actually limits the likelihood of wildfires. Come springtime, dry spots within forests and valleys were identified, and delegated community members would go ahead and prescribe burns to those areas. The picture here on the right is a Yurok elder, which is actually a native California tribe up in Northern California. Her name is Elizabeth Azuz, and she's actually leading a fire training exchange for the Cultural Fire Management Council. And this photo here was taken in 2019. Something else that I would like to focus on is that Indigenous peoples also had very complex language systems. Before Columbus came to the Americas, all of these language systems were very distinct and very specific to each tribe. There are at least 20 language families in California alone, which is one of the highest concentrations in the Americas. I did want to go ahead and just show kind of visually what this looks like. So this is a map identifying all of the different native language families. And if we zoom in here into what is now California, This is California here, and these are all of the different language families that have been identified. Each language family, as I said, has a complex structure ranging from 15 to 49 distinct language sounds. For example, the Mohawk Nation has 15 and other nations have as high as 49. Many of these languages are what's known as polysynthetic, meaning that one word has multiple meaningful parts that creates a single sentence or idea. Tribes have also been known to incorporate sign language and actually used it regularly to communicate with others. And the last kind of topic that I do want to touch on today is that Indigenous peoples have always been economic decision makers. The idea that Indigenous peoples were simple hunter-gatherers is false. Tribes often had to decide what to produce, how much to produce, and how to distribute goods and services for the betterment of their community. It has been evident that specialization was actually a practice done by many tribal nations. For example, in the Pueblo Nation, men were known to hunt actually very infrequently. This tribe relied on agriculture and extensive irrigation systems. However, other tribes like the Apache tribe were known to be very good hunters, and there is evidence that extensive trade went on between the two tribes to ensure that both tribes had an abundance of wild game and crops. It's actually also known that many of our freeways and highways in metropolitan areas today were actually based off of extensive trade routes that were used prior to Columbus coming to America. So has anyone here ever been on the I-8? Right? It's pretty common. The I-8 is actually known as the Kumeyaay Highway. This was an extensive trade route used by the Kumeyaay people of this land to trade with tribes from as far as Arizona. So what can you do, right? There's a lot of new information, I'm sure. I did put together a little information sheet that I will be sure to share with all of you. There are Kumeyaay specific resources, videos, articles, presentations. There are some resources on the Iroquois government system, as well as language resources, the land management that I spoke about, and a link to our resource page as a project as well. Okay, and with that, miigwech Vilamiye, thank you.
Thank you, Star. Let's move to Rachel Peterson.
Okay, let me pull up my slide.
Do you want to introduce yourself first as well?
Yeah, so hello, my name is Rochelle Peterson. I am Mountain Kuya from Saboba Indian Reservation, which is located in Riverside County here in Southern California. I am a school psychology trainee from San Diego State. And today I'm going to be talking about the California mission systems. And so here in the front, I just have some pictures from this top one is just a drawing of what kind of to depict what happened back then and how the Native people were seen to the priest. So this right here is the priest. And then down here is an actual picture from 1908, the Mission Indian Federation. So this is in Riverside County at the Mission Inn, which is still there today. You can see they have, I don't know if anybody knows about every Christmas they do like the lights, they light it up. This is that same mission that they have. And so today I'm going to be going over a few myths that you may have heard. So the first one is at the missions, American Indian people lived in peace and were treated well. And then the second one, American Indians were in need of saving. And then the third, American Indian people in the United States were behind in the world in culture and education. And then the fourth one, at the missions, American Indian people were willing and happy helpers. And so just to start off, I wanted to ask you all, So these two pictures are from the 4th grade mission project. I think some do it in 5th grade as well. But I wanted to ask, what do you remember about building these missions, and or what history do you remember learning about these missions? So if you want to just unmute and share, or you can put it in the chat if that's more comfortable.
I personally don't think I did this project, but what we did go visit mission, and I guess like kind of like their way of life and like I guess the vibe. And I guess what we learned was like, you know, the indigenous were kind of forced to live there, but I guess we didn't go into great detail about it. It was just more focused on like the European side of the mission.
Do you remember what mission? Was it in San Diego?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure it's like 20-30 minutes away from around here. I'm not sure what the name was, but I know we visited one.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. And does anybody else remember anything about even visiting a mission?
In my experience, we kind of focused more on like religious aspects, like Catholicism and like how they went about their daily life there, and not so much about like Native American peoples.
So do you remember them teaching, like, was it a good experience for the Native people, or?
Yeah, they didn't really go into a lot of details about Native American lifestyle. It was more about like the priests there and stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody else have before I move on? So a lot of us in California, this is a project that we end up doing in 4th grade. And from my perspective, I remember when I was in 4th grade, we were assigned to do this project as well. And I don't remember them teaching, you know, anything good about the missions or telling the true story of what happened to the Native people. And I remember I had talked to my teacher and I told her, this isn't a project that I feel comfortable doing, because I grew up at home learning about what really happened and learning about my family who were forced into these missions. We were taught these stories of what actually happened. And so it was really personal for me having family being forced into these missions and still having those effects on next generations today. And so I remember telling my teacher all these things, and she kind of dismissed what I said and kind of, well, you know, you need to do it. It's an assignment that has to be done. And to me, as a California native and having family kind of experience this, it was like a slap in my face that, you know, our side of what happened didn't matter, that it also felt like it didn't happen. So she was kind of ignoring what was really going on there and just pushed it to the side. So as California natives, having to do this in 4th grade, it's kind of like it's like really personal and emotional, and especially being so young, excuse me, it's a difficult thing. So today we're going to kind of talk about how the history of what really did happen and how what you can do to change these things in school. I'm going to show a video, and this is a video of 4 California Indian leaders, and they're kind of just sitting together and they're talking about the stories of the kidnappings, the slavery, and the massacres that took place with the Spanish and with the mission specifically. And I like this video because they do touch on a lot of what I'm going to talk about, but I like this video because the power behind what these elders share and their connection to their experience of what happened. So let me play this. Can you all hear?
Junipero Serra was the founder of the California mission system, first of all. He, prior to coming to California, he was in Mexico. And he was working down there with one part of the community he worked with was a Jewish community that came from Europe. And they brought him to the New World, trying to take the Jewish out of them, and they promised to become Catholic. They were looking for a place to survive. And so whenever he was working with the Jewish in Mexico, he never believed that they truly converted. And so whenever he came to California, he was convinced that he had to break the culture before they would truly convert. And that's why he was so brutal. So when they came here, they looked to destroy our humanity, our spirituality, our culture, and our environments. The way they would capture the Indians, a lot of people talked about, how the Indians came to the missions voluntarily. We have in our oral history, and it's documented as well, of the soldiers would go out and do an early morning raid. They would identify the village site that they were going, where they would have the raid, and then the soldiers on horseback would attack that village site, and they would target the women. They would capture the women, and then they would tie them together, thumb to thumb, to form a human chain. Once all the women were captured, they'd start marching them back to the mission. And when they marched back to the mission, they knew the children would naturally follow their mothers. And they knew that it was just a matter of a short period of time before the husbands and the men would come in to be with their families. That's how many of the many Indians were taken to the missions at the beginning of the mission period. Once they got to the mission, they couldn't speak their language. They couldn't wear their clothing. They couldn't. Men from the women, from the children were separated. That was to break the culture. The children, they did not want the parents passing that knowledge on to the children until the parents were converted or the children were converted to Catholicism. There was whippings, brutality. I said they separated the women. The soldiers did not bring a bunch of their wives or families, and there wasn't a lot of other women here for them. And so they would go into that woman's barracks and just rape the women continuously. There was slavery. There was absolute slavery. The Indians were not allowed to leave. They were totally controlled by the church. That went on to the Mexican period.
So that brings us to the 21 California missions. So he touched on a little bit about Father Serra. So the establishment of the Jesuit missions began in 1697 in Loreto, which is in southern Baja California Peninsula, which down here, if you can see, it's like way down here. Portola and Father Serra, so they came from the missions in Spain. They arrived in San Diego in June 29th, 1769. And Portola, he had this idea that he wanted to go up the coast and continue to establish more of these missions, while Father Serra stayed down in San Diego, working on converting the native people to Christianity to bring them under the control of the missions. And so as you can see, like all the way up this map, these are the 21 missions that were established. And on July 16th, 1769, Father Serra established San Diego de Alcala mission, which down here, you can see it's the first one on the bottom. This is the first mission of the 21 missions in Alta California that were built from San Diego all the way up here at the top to Sonoma. And they also established what was called a presidio, which is a fort. And they put these near each mission. You can see the little triangle. They were near each mission so that the Spanish soldiers were able to stay there, and they could make sure they can put their authority over the native people to keep them in control and keep them from leaving the missions. And so the Spanish, they would go village by village all the way up the coast in attempts to take over each village by taking their women, like he mentioned in the video, and their children first, so that they knew that the fathers would follow after. Many villages, though, they fought back and they refused to allow them to take them to the missions, which I'll touch on in the next slide. So here's just a map of the California pre-contact territory, just to give you a little visual of what Native people resided along the coast. So down here, you can see this was where the first mission was established in San Diego. And this is the Tipai Ipai people, which are the Kumeyaay people who are still here today in San Diego. So this was where it was at, and it went all the way up the coast, and they hit all these different Native nations. And so the Indian life at the missions, Father Sarah introduced a policy known as reducciones, which is reductions, which meant that they were able to kidnap and force Native people to live into these missions. And they forced, with the goal of forcing Native people into a new religion and a new way of life in efforts to assimilate to their religion and lifestyle. And this was done because he mentioned in the video, in order to get them to kind of follow their rule, they believed that they had to break their culture, break their language, and kind of start them from the beginning and teach them their own ways. And Native people were punished for speaking their language, practicing their culture, or any other form of their Native traditional lifestyle. So they weren't allowed to speak to each other in their language or practice any cultures or anything like that. And they were kind of forced to adopt this new language and religion. And so the Spanish perceived, this was because the Spanish perceived Native people as uncivilized, immoral people. So they felt that Native people prior to their contact, they didn't know anything, they didn't know what they were doing, that they kind of needed the Spanish help to live. And so the life at the missions lasted about 6 years once you entered. So this was because of all the brutality that went on and the ill treatment of the Native people. Oh, I'm sorry, I think I missed the picture. Oh no. And so when the Spanish came, they brought disease, abuse, hunger, and genocide. So there were about 40,000 American Indians in the area of Baja, and this was in 1697. And by 1768, there were only about 7,000 Native people after that. So you can see that was a huge drop between not only about 100 years. And so more Spanish colonists settled the lands that belonged to the California Native people. And as they were coming in from Spain and kind of taking over these traditional lands, they began to start destroying the land and the natural resources that these Native people had relied on for survival for thousands of years. Excuse me. And the Spanish took over the Kumeyaay land near the mission, the San Diego mission, to reinforce supports for that mission. So making sure that the Native people stayed into the missions and they weren't leaving or trying to get away. And they did this because they thought that it was their right of discovery and it entitled them to the land. So they felt that that God allowed them to have this right to taking over these lands and helping these Native people. So you can see in these pictures right here, this top left one, this is some of the Native children with the from the church. And this is in front of, I think, the San Diego mission. And then right here, this is just a drawing of what happened with the first contact of Father Sarah and Portolo and some of the Native people. And so the Kumeyaay mission experience. So for the mission system, education of the Kumeyaay was tied to brutality. So as they were teaching the Kumeyaay people this new religion and new language, they used brutality to kind of align them into doing what they wanted. So the deprivation of food. So sometimes they weren't they weren't fed if they didn't follow what they needed to. There was slave labor going on, so they received lashings as a form of punishment in the education process. And then there was a lot of sexual abuse against the women and the girls in these missions, and then cultural genocide as well. So not being able to speak your language and your culture to pass it on to the next generation kind of created that barrier that we still see today. A lot of us don't know our culture or language, or we're trying to get it back. And this is because of this process of the mission. A lot of Native people after this were scared to speak their language to their children and pass their culture on because they didn't want their children to experience the same thing they did. And so that was their way of kind of protecting them. And then with the disease, living in these missions, they lived in crowded, filthy rooms with very little ventilation. They resulted in outbreaks of many different diseases, smallpox, chickenpox, and things like that. And the disease spread across California to other Native groups who came in contact with anyone that came from the San Diego mission. So anytime the soldiers went out looking, scouting for new villages to take over, or anytime if the Kumeyaay were out, if they escaped the mission or whatever it was, it spread the disease across California. And that is why we see, like, during this time, a big drop of numbers in Native people is because of this disease, these different diseases they brought. And so down here, this is a picture from the San Diego mission. And these are some of the Native kids in front of it. And then on this side as well, I think this is an older one from a different point of view, but these are both the San Diego mission. And so the Kumeyaay revolt, excuse me, at San Diego mission on November 5th, 1775, a group of several hundred Kumeyaay Indians attacked just after midnight. And so around midnight, the Kumeyaay sent in 40 Kumeyaay leaders, sent in warriors to help with the battle. And so they planned this as a strike of two groups. So one group attacked the mission, and then the other attacked the Presidio, which is the soldiers' fort next to the mission. And they were tired. They were just tired of the mistreatment of their people, and specifically, it was the treatment of the women and the children. The men had spoke to Father Sarah, telling them about what the soldiers were doing to their women, and he didn't do anything about it. And so the Kumeyaay men were just getting very tired of what was happening to them, so they kind of took it into their own hands to protect their own people. And so during this attack, they killed 3 soldiers, and they killed Father Luis Jaime. And at the same time, they burnt the mission to the ground. So you can see in this bottom picture, this is a picture after the attack. They kind of knocked it down, as well as the top one. This one's an old one as well. And so more Indians at this mission died than were baptized. So that just shows you the big number of what happened there. And so what can you do? So you can get educated. You can research the local tribes in your areas. There are a lot of websites. A lot of tribal communities have this history on their tribal websites. You can look at the different books. There's a lot of books out there that talk about the California mission systems. There's videos. You can check out YouTube, as well as the SPA resource page. We have a lot of information on there as well. And I think we'll share it at the end of our presentations. And then ask questions. So ask questions about the American Indian perspective and experience in your classes. So whatever you're learning, history, whatever's going on that you're learning in history about US, you can ask what was going on with the Native people at that time. How did they play a role in these specific events? And educate others. What you learned here today, you can teach other people and kind of spread this knowledge around. And this is important because before healing can take place, we all need to acknowledge the truth of the California Indian genocide. Achma, thank you for listening. And I will pass it over to Carol.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That's pretty close to home, huh? I think our next speaker is going to speak on mascots, which is also profoundly important. But before we do that, because we've just gotten this sort of barrage of information, let me ask for a couple of minutes, you want to put a comment or a question or a reaction in the chat, or unmute and say something. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for all the information. And I had some questions. So it seems that what I've heard, because I'm not very familiar with the Native American culture, I'm barely familiar with the Western culture. So, but from what I heard from the experience of the students that talked out is that the education system doesn't focus on the Native American part and what they felt during these missions. and it's mostly what the point of the missions and the priests, the church, the Catholicism, are mostly like the European side of. Why do you think this is still the case after or not maybe centuries, but after like a lot of years later? Why do you think this is still happening if we have grown from that time?
I can kind of maybe speak to that a little bit. Personally, I didn't grow up in California. I grew up in Texas in the Plains area where we had boarding schools, which very similar, if not the exact same experience as the missions. But that would require the U.S. government to admit that they had a mistreatment and admit that there was an actual genocide in this country. You will not find a president or a government official who's willing to admit that this country's government was responsible for this, essentially the genocide of many tribes and the stripping of cultures of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And as you know, typically the winners of these wars are the ones that write the history books. So we get left out of the history books and are often forgotten due to a lack of representation, due to a lack of numbers. And like I said before, you'd have to find a government official willing to admit a mistake made by the government, which is few and far between.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on that. So since they're not ready to admit it, why do they like keep doing the boarding schools, keeping tribes from having like jurisdiction in their area and stuff? Why do you think they still like are kind of erasing indigenous culture?
I personally think it's been a battle that's consistently happened since the beginning of what we call the peace treaty era. There have been government implementations. There was the Indian Removal Act. There was the Indian Relocation Act. So there were these government acts that were in the 60s and the 70s, not too long ago, where they're still trying to eradicate the history of the people. Our funding from the federal government lacks, our Indian Health Services lacks. There's so many different issues with the government's treatment that continues to go wrong. But until they admit that these treaties they signed were actual formal legal documents, we can't get past that. And they'll continue to deny that these treaties were signed and continue to take land and resources. But I think, capitalism plays a huge part in it, and our U.S. government willing to admit it.
It's such a great question. I think the other issue is, or a parallel issue is one of voice, is where is the voice of the people that were being talked about? And where is the voice, as you said, as you asked initially, what about the other side of the perspective of what's gone on historically or in many other ways too? And I think that right now we have this wonderful opportunity with so much of a anti-racist movement in the country. And including in some schools, they're looking for how can I make this different? And so I know one of your missions is to bring in the truth, and to bring that to your school. It's an exciting time to begin to undo some of the many, many mistruths that have happened and continue to happen.
Do you think that it's like redeemable for the government? Do you think there's a way for them to bring it back, or do you think like the culture is just going to end up being eliminated?
I think there's a lot of tribes that are doing just the opposite of that, of trying to revitalize culture and language through language groups. There's quite a few Native American languages that are on Rosetta Stone now, which wasn't the case in the past, but holding on to our elders and keeping those that speak the language as priorities and to teach, because we see a lot of our culture is passed down through that language. And us as tribes, as entities that are sovereign nations, it's kind of up to them to revitalize it, each entity on their own. We're not going to expect a ton of help from the U.S. government, but at the same time, the efforts are going along, and a lot of different tribes across the country you see with language revitalization, with culture classes, with elders teaching. So we can see a lot of it depending on the tribe. Some tribes are a lot further along than others. But I think that process is continuing to happen slowly but surely.
In fact, right here in San Diego, there are efforts to revive the Kumeyaay language and the culture through the language. There are language classes, and one person just put some classes online that instantly 27 people joined. It's very small numbers. There are 36 language speakers left in Kumeyaay, but the young people are beginning to learn, and they're anxious to learn. One of the things our project does is to work with the young people on their own resilience and their own identity, so that somebody's speaking to them in positive terms about who they are and what their history is, what they're capable of, and what their futures might look like. So part of our work is to work in that kind of a way with the youth.
I don't follow up on that. I might be ignorant on this topic, but where is the voice? Like, where is the voice of Native Americans? Like, we have like Martin Luther King for the Black Americans. We have uh, many like when you think of a race and then the name pops up, that's the person that sort of try to voice the concern. But where is the Native Americans? Are they still like they don't want to talk to other people, or they do but they don't get the chance? What is it?
The voice that comes to mind first off when I hear, I think of the American Indian movement that was started in the 60s and 70s as a result of just these government acts that were used to eradicate us up into the 60s. But I think of Russell Means and John Trudell, and those were two major activists in the American Indian movement, both recently passed, unfortunately. But their efforts were huge in getting us somewhat on the spotlight. I don't know if you guys are probably way too young to remember whenever Martin Scorsese won the Oscar for Best Picture, and he had a Native American woman accept his honor because there was a actual holdup going on at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, and they were held up in there, and there was a protest, but he spoke to that as a means, and that's something that Russell Means started too. But those are the two names that come to mind for me. It's just we don't have the representation, like you say, but we're starting to see it in government. We have a couple of Native women that are in the actual Senate and Congress right now for the first time ever. So that's a big plus for us and a big start for us.
There's also a wonderful National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. that represents a whole variety of cultures beautifully. And the curator of that museum, director of that museum, has done a whole lot to put Indigenous voice out onto the web. So the NMA, the National Museum has a website with lots of information. There's a National Congress of American Indians. There's a National Indian Education Association. And so these groups are quite large and represent multiple tribes and lots of information within those fields. But you're right, there's not sort of one spokesman right now, spokesperson right now. Winona LaDuke is another person, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Let's move on to the issue of mascots, Jacob. Introduce yourself.
All right. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so the misconception that I would like to address is what is wrong with honoring Native Americans as mascots, whether it be for a sports team, for a school, whatever it may be. My name is Stephen Jacob Price. I'm a school psychologist. I'll be presenting today, like I said, with our San Diego State family. So a quick background on myself. I was born in Wichita Falls, Texas. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I'm also what we call an urban Indian. I didn't grow up on the reserve. My family comes from Oklahoma. I represent the Pawnee, the Oto, and the Kaw nations, all from Oklahoma. The thing with Oklahoma is there's one reservation in the state of Oklahoma, but there's a lot of tiny allotments of land that are called reserves. So I didn't grow up on the reserve. I grew up spending my summers there and visiting family and trying to keep that link with my culture. But growing up in cities is often a different experience for Native Americans. I suffered from what was a lot of cultural confusion. Growing up in Texas, there was not a lot of Native Americans, especially in North Texas. I was often confused as being Latino or Hispanic, and people would often speak Spanish to me, thinking that I know the language. And that changed when I moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where there's a rather large population of Native Americans. People often didn't think that I was Native American, or had a hard time believing it, because me and my sister didn't look like what the stereotypical mainstream view of what a Native American looks like or what they're supposed to look like. Currently, I'm working as my 10th year as a school psychologist. I work in the state of Colorado. I'm in southern Colorado, which is all southern Ute land. Chief Uray and his wife Chipita were the chiefs of this land that I sit on right now, less than 100 years ago. And that land was taken by treaty, like a lot of other lands we talk about. So like I said, the misconception I want to talk about: is it offensive to portray Native Americans as a team mascot? Is it? If it is, why? If it's not, why not? Is it honoring? And that's kind of what I want to talk about. So we see that there are many professional college K through 12 schools that have Native Americans portrayed as mascots. And that could either be a Native American specifically by person in his name or her name. It could be a stereotyped Native American entity, or it could be a tribe itself, or anything related to a stereotypical Native American aspect. We see, as far as colleges go, Division 1, 2, and 3, there's over 500 colleges that have Native depicted mascots. When we look at, elementary, middle, and high schools, it's unknown the exact number, but it is known to be in the thousands. Of course, there's many K through 12 schools and not as many colleges, but the number of mascots being depicted out there in elementary schools is outrageously high. In 2015, the NCAA conducted a self-evaluation on mascot names. They wanted to determine if any of these names were offensive or hostile or demeaning. And of course, San Diego State and their Aztec mascot was included in that evaluation. So we see some examples of mascot names on the right. These are some of the names that were considered to be offensive and hostile, and that they were changed. Some of these come from big Division I schools like the Fighting Illini, and some of them come from smaller Division III schools that might be lesser known. But things like the Red Chiefs and the Mohawks, the Fighting Sioux, those have all been changed since 2015. To give you a better idea, these are mascots that are still currently being used, whether it be, like I said, Division I, II, or III colleges. I'm not going to read the list, but we see a couple like Little Indians. I see the Pawnees on there, which is my tribe, but there still are a ton of mascots out there in colleges and professional sports that are being used. From that 2015 self-evaluation from the NCAA, they determined that 19 teams were cited as having hostile or abusive mascots or images, and that they would be banned from displaying them during any postseason play, and prohibited from showing any of these mascots, any of these symbols, pictures during their tournaments. When they're hosting a tournament, they can't display these. The NCAA at the time did not cite San Diego State University as having a hostile or abusive mascot. They cited that the Aztec people having no modern representation, which just goes to show that we continue to be forgotten about. There are Aztec people still alive today, and they do have representation in California. They even included a human sacrifice during the mascot would be involved in a human sacrifice that drew lots of criticism. A San Diego State professor of American Indian Studies stated that the mascot teaches the mistaken idea that the Aztecs were local tribe rather than living in Mexico, which is thousands of miles away from San Diego. In 2017, the university's Associated Students Council rejected a resolution to retire the mascot. That same year, faculty also voted to abolish the mascot. And we still see that they did not stop the human sacrifice. They merely altered it in a way that they considered it to be honoring. So the San Diego State mascot issue is one that I continue to keep an eye on in battle. And it's one that I hold close to my heart. Being an alumni, I graduated San Diego State in 2011. And to see them still continuing with this battle makes me sad. I would like to see this changed sooner than later. So the National Congress of the American Indian released a video about 7 years ago. At the time, it was when the push for, when we talk about our pyramid of mascots, and the one that was on top that natives wanted to get knocked down was the Washington Redskins. That one, a lot of tribes felt was horribly demeaning and not at all representative of our culture. So the National Indian Congress released a video. Can you guys see the video? Did I change it?
Not yet.
Okay.
Proud,
Hold on.
forgotten, Indian.
Okay. Sorry. Can you guys see now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a short little clip the National Indian Congress released in 2014. This is a video I've seen. It's 2 minutes long, but it still gives me goosebumps when I watch it.
Proud, forgotten, Indian. Navajo, Blackfoot, Inuit, and Sioux. Survivor, spiritualist, patriot. Sitting Bull, Hiawatha, and Jim Thorpe. Mother, father, son, daughter, chief. Apache, Pueblo, Choctaw, Chippewa, and Crow. Underserved, struggling, resilient. Squanto, Red Cloud, Tecumseh, and Crazy Horse. Rancher, teacher, doctor, soldier. Seminole, Seneca, Mohawk, and Creek. Mills, Will Rogers, Geronimo. Unyielding, strong, indomitable. Native Americans call themselves many things. The one thing they don't.
Like I said, that was a National Congress of the American Indian. And that was when they really started to ramp up efforts to change the Redskins mascot.
Recently.
Sorry. Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Okay. So what we saw, they released a statement. They said many people and organizations are starting to grapple with the ways in which their policies, behaviors, and perhaps they themselves have condoned and perpetuated discriminatory and racist behavior. As long as Native mascots continue to be allowed in Major League Baseball, National Hockey League, and the National Football League, any action taken to end systemic racism will fall short. Racism is racism, no matter how you look at it. And so for the National Indian Congress, the goal is to start with the professional teams. They're being the most well-known throughout the nation, especially the Redskins, in the most popular sport in America. So then I'll ask, after hearing some of the history that you got to hear from Star and Rochelle, some of the background with the missions, I ask, is it considered honoring to depict a group of people that were treated so bad by this government, and then for people to decide whether or not they can be offended by a depiction of themselves? Is that considered honoring? So on the converse side, you see this was back in 2016. And I know some of you guys are in high school. And I don't know if you remember the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, or the No DAPL. There was a pipeline being run through traditional Lakota land that was going through their reservation in Cannonball, South Dakota. That was their land via treaty. Now, they were running a pipeline underneath a lake, and the water protectors went and peacefully protested this pipeline. They were met with military force, water cannons sprayed in freezing cold weather, shot with rubber bullets, percussion grenades. They used the auditory torture devices to keep them away, and put up chain link razor wire. At that exact same night, at the exact same time, the Cleveland Indians are playing in the World Series. And we see a stadium filled with people wearing headdresses, wearing red face, cheering for Chief Wahoo. So I ask, is it considered, are we honoring our Native people when that the same night we can see these two just contradictions of themselves? One group of actual Native Americans peacefully protesting being met with military force, or celebrating Native Americans at a baseball game by wearing red face and a headdress. So we all know that this summer was a big summer of social change. We saw with the death and the murder, of George Floyd, that sparked a huge growth and momentum of people that wanted to address social issues, and they wanted to do it now. We saw that the Washington Redskins dropped their name this last season and became the Washington football team. We've also heard that the Cleveland Indians are no longer going to be using that name, or Chief Wahoo, their mascot. And Chief Wahoo was by far one of the more blatantly stereotypical racist mascots we've seen in any sport. So we've seen two of the big ones drop, and we're seeing this momentum with this change. So I say the time is now. We know that this isn't the most pressing issue in Indian country. We deal with issues that are killing our people, that are hurting our people. We struggle with Indian health services, with education, with so many different areas. The mascot isn't the main thing on the list, but it is an easy fix. And it's a fix that can be done and should have been done a long time ago. So that's what I wanted to bring up, knowing that there are greater issues in Indian country that we face. But this is one that is a no-brainer to me. It seems like it could be easily fixed. So there's a group that started around the same time that National Indian Congress released the video, and they are called the Illuminative Group. And this is a statement they released this summer saying, "We are living an unprecedented moment of solidarity, and people across the country have come together to take a stand against racism in any form. In these past weeks, major steps have been taken to remove racist mascots and imagery, such as Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben have altered their brandings, and NASCAR has banned the Confederate flags. Monuments of Confederate soldiers, Christopher Columbus, and slave traders have been toppled in cities across the world. Banning the use of Native mascots, names, and imagery in sports is the next step. Native American symbols, personalities, and stereotypes as mascots. When we talk about a mascot is designed to symbolize a certain group or an organization. It exists to bring good luck and to build a sense of camaraderie. The existence of mascots recalling indigenous themes and iconography reduces indigenous identity as to these stereotypes. National sport teams, including the Indians and the Redskins, have recently vowed to change their names as an acknowledgement of this deep-rooted prejudice and pain associated with such characteristics. characterizations, excuse me. Despite this, we still see that there are thousands of mascots that continue to be used in the United States. So what can you do as a student, as a high school student, and reaching out to a group like Carol's project is a huge first step. That is a big part of being able to advocate to what we consider marginalized populations. Education is key. As you guys know, our American public school system is not going to teach you the plight of the Native American. You have to do your own research sometimes. You have to look and understand what the resource is, where you're reading it, and make sure you're getting good information. There was also a message from the National the National Education Association of America. And it was a short video I was going to show, but in time-wise, I'll go ahead and skip it, but it's a Native American teacher talking about how their mascot, she was seeing it hurt her students, feeling marginalized and not wanting to play sports because they were the Redskins in high school. And there was a Native population there that felt they didn't belong to a group that was supposed to be honoring them. So here I have a list of a couple of websites. The Lumen Natives ChangeTheName.org is a group that is huge and active in doing the mascot change. And then from there, am I unshared?
You are unshared now.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not the best with technology. Thanks for bearing with me on that one.
I think you're doing great. That was really.
But that's where I have, where we are with the mascots now. And that's why I chose it to talk about now, because I feel now's the time. Like I said, there's tons of pressing issues that are hurting our people that are far more important than whether or not a football team is named after a tribe. But it's time. It's time, and it's time to change the San Diego State mascot too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we will provide you all also copies and links to all of those resources. We will also figure out how to add them to our own resource website. Let's see here, which we've mentioned a couple of times. Somebody can put that up on the chat. Let me just open up the discussion now to comments, reactions, responses, questions.
Yeah, I had a question. Do you think like the government or like the education system will like ever address like the settler colonial roots of like their systems? Or do you think it will always just be like, I guess, indigenous people and other people advocating for like social reform, but it like, I guess, not really happening? Like even in our school, we at least at CCA, we have actually two options for history. We have the regular AP World History, and we have a course called Non-Western, and it's actually run by my teacher who like looks at stuff from a decolonized perspective. But like, of course, colleges aren't going to get credit for that. So all the students go to normal world history, where it's all from the Western perspective. So you think there will ever be a point where I guess the settler colonial roots are like, hey, we did this, we admit to it, and we're gonna like bring about change?
I think for me personally, I didn't learn a ton besides hearing from my family's history, but educationally until I got into college. I was fortunate enough to go to a school that had a high Native American population at Fort Lewis College in Durango. I learned a ton in college that I didn't know from my own family. It's we have our oral histories and traditions, and some of them aren't written. It's until we get those people in places of power that are actually going to listen to the voices of those that want change, which I saw somebody put in the comments, Deb Haaland is now in the Congress, which is a huge first step that we have Native people representing us in Congress. Will we see a Native American president one day? I think that would be great. I think that would be the first step in seeing some of these changes. But until we get higher into the the policies and politics of who makes the educational decisions, you know, it's not very likely we're going to learn the truth.
I think at the same time, your generation has a consciousness and information and access to information that my generation didn't. And so I think that change is slow, unfortunately. Sometimes it's forced. But as you take your commitments into your own professions, into some of you will become educators, hopefully. Some of you will influence policy. And those are the kinds of actions and actionable, the actionable part of our social justice that pushes that change. Your voices are going to be really critical in making this happen.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think that it takes a group like yourself to kind of advocate for this, really push for what you want and for this change in your own school, or other students as well from different schools, to advocate that this is what you want, this is what needs to be done, needs to be changed. There's a school back home, San Jacinto High School. There was a group of students working towards getting, there's a high population of Native kids who attend that high school from my tribal community. And so they were pushing towards getting a history class that represented the true story of history and the Native perspective. And they actually went all the way up to, I think like I don't know what it's called, but the board in Sacramento, and they fought to get a new course, not just as an elective, but something that will count in replacement of US history. And it unfortunately didn't get passed this last year, but they're still continuing to push. And they have, I think what's really important is to find a teacher on campus who can be your ally, who can help you develop these courses, this plan of what you want to get done. I think that you guys have the power to do that. You just really have to voice what you want and really get a big group to support you. And I think having an ally is very important on campus.
On the mascot issue, I think I had a question. So like we've talked to other cultural groups as well. And some of them were Asians, that they talked about cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. So if you think that some of these mascots are offensive, which they are, then how do you think would be the proper way to basically appreciate the culture?
That's a great question. And there are actually a couple of schools that come to mind that actually do it the proper way. The Utah Utes, the Florida State Seminoles are two schools that have linked with the tribe and get input from tribal leaders. They ask permission to use the name. The mascots they use out before a football game is a member of that tribe. And then they share some of the profits from the, all the accessories and all the shirts and everything they sell. They share profits with the tribe. So it's a teamwork process, and I can say the one that does it the best is probably the Utah Utes, being that they asked the actual tribe themselves whose land they were on if they could use their name, and did that, like I said, with conjunction of tribal leaders, and sat down and did a planning process. So if you include the people that you're honoring in that process and they feel comfortable with the way you handle it, then I see nothing wrong with it. It's when you decide for them that, for example, I can say I worked at a high school here in Colorado whose mascot was the Indians. Now, the emblem on the football helmets was depicted what looked like a Plains Native American with the headdress. At the football field, they had a totem pole, and then they had another thing that represented a Pacific Northwest tribe, a Plains tribe, and then a Southwest tribe, where they say they're honoring, but who exactly are they honoring? We're on Ute land, and nothing that they depicted in their emblem mascots or what they show depicts Ute stuff. It all depicts from different varied tribes that all over the country. They just think they lump together as an Indian. So it depends on your intention, what your goal is, and if it is truly to honor, then you have to include the people that you say you're honoring.
I think more broadly, thank you. I think more broadly, we're also talking about truth telling. What are the local histories of the native peoples where you are? What is the truth of what happened? So giving voice to people, inviting elders into classrooms. So there are lots of ways to honor people other than making them into mascots. Rayvon, you were going to share a couple of ideas. Do you want to unmute and share those?
Yeah, I was just going to mention kind of the same thing that Jacob had mentioned about just kind of land acknowledgement and kind of the history, because a lot of times people don't know, they're on native land. And somebody had asked me a similar question when I was in undergrad at Dickinson College, where in fact it's so near the Carlisle Indian boarding school that, the undergraduates there didn't even know that existed, the history, the deep history that happened in Carlisle. So one of the things I mentioned was, just letting them know wherever you are, ask and wonder and look it up. What native community was removed from this area? Whose land is this on? So just kind of getting familiar with the history is one way without having to be all open about it. And if you want to just kind of get to know, who is in this area, and especially if you're using native imagery or representation and idea, I say resources and money first off, especially if you're profiting off of, if you have like a business or a brand and it's related to that. And it's so hard and frustrating because people will still use the idea and say that they're honoring Native people where there's like no resources or funding going into that community. So yeah, I mean, those are just some of the ideas that I had.
Thanks so much.
With that, there's actually a lot of different like app advances and different ways that Native people are using like technology to really get that information out there. There's actually a number, I can put it in the chat, that you can text along with like your zip code or your city and state, and it will tell you exactly whose land you're on and the tribal nation that is specific to that area that you're on. So that's something as well that you could pass to your peers or something that you could look into. It's just kind of something that's interesting.
I guess the main point and just the whole thing is that education is key. You need to research yourself, you need to research, you need to educate yourself. And we've been trying to give that for every meeting that we had and through every conversation that we had. And you talked about the availability of information. I believe that availability of information is also one of the problems because uh, it's been actually researched that misinformation and like information that's sort of emotional passes much more quickly through social media. It's 50% of people who use social media as their news source. So when you have that huge surge of people using the social media, and it's causing one of the problems, we need more people to be on the platform and speak about it, because you know what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to say, if we are able to reach out to people who are willing to put their art, I know some people have done that on TikTok, which is great, but to put their art outside their own comfort zone, I think that would be a great step forward. I don't know, what's your comments on that, if you have anything.
I think social media right now is probably one of the main players in both information and misinformation. You guys' generation right now, I say that coming in as the old guy, but y'all's generation is the one that is going to pioneer this this social media, internet, what's real, what's fake type of information, and that's going to be key is the Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, those types of media. And there's tons of natives on media that are pushing the cultural change and things like that. And I can get a list. We have someone in our group that has a list of influential Native American Instagrammers, and some that are on TikTok that are true, and speak the truth. And that's really a good way to get out information these days. Used to be we'd have to get published, and now it's you can share something, a video, and it can be seen by millions of people in in weeks. But let me find that list of the influential Native Americans, and then I'll go see if I can get that to y'all.
I think, Megan, you also had some ideas of resources around this.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. So there's a bunch of resources on the website that's already been shared, but I want to share one website that I don't know if it's on our website yet. It needs to get up there if not. But this is a website that's directed towards Native youth. And so for me, it's been really helpful. I don't identify as Native, so it's been helpful to learn from this website about issues that impact Native youth. So there's things about relationships, about health, all sorts of things. And their social media links are up at the upper right of that as well. So it may be another thing to check out. I appreciate the curiosity of this group. So yeah.
Okay. If no one else has any questions, please, if you do, interrupt me. But I think we're getting at the end of our time here. But thank you so much for presenting. It was wonderful info, and we hope to, because we recorded the meeting, we hope to post it on all our social media platforms and inform our peers and educators to learn about this topic, because I think that the brutality that Indian Americans faced throughout the history should not be unnoticeable. But yeah, if you have any ending remarks, you're more than welcome to, but thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting us again. We are excited to share information that we have and perspectives to begin to dispel these myths. And we're also very excited about you. And as Megan noted, your curiosity, but you're also your commitments, your ideas of going into social action and to policy work. And so it's a reciprocal kind of thank you from us. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
It's definitely a win-win when we're able to share some of our truths, especially with the group that's interested. You guys are the future. You guys are the change when it comes. It's going to be your generation, and feel free to reach out to us for any more information. We love an opportunity to share. You guys stay hungry for knowledge. That's key.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Would you mind sending us the recording so we can use it?
Pardon me?
Would you mind sending us the recording through email?
Well, I'll send you that. Yeah. And it'll come back to me today. I'll send you a link to it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so
again.
much. Yeah, bye.
Bye-bye.